Whenever I'm down in London, I have to do what every other political science student does and go visit the grave of Karl Marx in Highgate Cemetery. But what I didn't know after visiting the first time was that clustered around the grave of Karl Marx in Highgate are a number of other really notable communists with an interesting history. I found dozens of other graves there, and I thought that I would highlight a few of them and give their stories. There are tens, if not hundreds, or even thousands of videos of these people going to Highgate and filming Karl Marx's grave and ignoring all of these other revolutionaries that played key roles throughout history, or at least are pretty interesting footnotes in larger revolutions. As a young man, journalist Paul Foote moved to Glasgow, Scotland, following the promise of work for a newspaper, and the stated reason for his joining was that he was going to weed out the trats and sort of expose them, weed them out, and not give them a mouthpiece or any sort of soapbox to stand on. But he also went around doing other things, and what really interested him was life on the shipyards. He began talking to shipyard workers, many of whom went and joined a group called Young Socialists. And this was not so much a champagne socialist group, it was a true blue-collar working man's socialist group.
When I was looking at these things in Glasgow when I was a young man in the early 1960s, I remember that there were regularly 41 people coming together in Glasgow who called themselves socialists. I remember the figure, there were always these 41, and they belonged to about 9 or 10 separate organizations, and most of the meetings were fighting each other about some abstruse theory of theory, some abstruse theory of what happened in the Belgian strike, or the theory of surplus value, whether Russia was state capitalist for that matter. All these things were argued out between us, and all the argument was turned inwards towards other socialists. And again, I looked for an organization which actually sought to establish its argument in the real world, which sought to look outwards all the time, to find where its argument was relevant to the people outside in the real world. And this, the International Socialists constantly did.
At the same time, he began reading works by people like Lenin, Marx, and Rosa Luxemburg, the really core foundations for Marxism and left-wing thought. Now, his work as a journalist was on and off for a while. He was sometimes sacked for his radical views, but in 1978, he managed to nail a job for the Private Eye, a private investigative journal.
What the paper says, presented by Paul Foote, columnist on the Daily Mirror.
Good evening. I'm sorry to start this programme up again on a sombre note, but it's been a grim week for journalists. This morning's Guardian reported,
Bazoft's body returns.
The body of Farzad Bazoft, the Observer journalist hanged in Iraq last Thursday, is to be flown to Britain today, the Foreign Office said.
He was given the one provision of no Socialist Workers' Party propaganda, which, surprisingly, given his character, he was able to accomplish. The Private Eye is a sort of sub-paper of the Daily Mirror, and he stayed with this paper for 14 years, pretty much on and off, but eventually he ran into a little bit of trouble by claiming that the leaders of the Daily Mirror were engaged in union busting, or breaking up workers' unions that would try to organize and get more rights and higher pay for workers. And when he was 66 years old, still a revolutionary, he died of a heart attack, and on his death he was still very much celebrated by the Daily Mirror, who gave him a very large funeral, and there was much eulogizing for him. And another friend of Foote, a man named Chris Harmon, was also a revolutionary and also a journalist. He started in 1961, joining a group called the Socialist Review, and at a separate time, he began a doctorate in economics under Ralph Miliband at the London School of Economics, something he ultimately didn't complete because he was pursuing his career in journalism, a career that worked out pretty well for him. And you can say what you want to about communists. I'm not a communist myself, but this man did have a certain set of morals and principles. There's a lot of communists who will look on people like Joseph Stalin or Chairman Mao, and they're called tankies in political science as a joke. They make excuses for it, and this man, who was a journalist, didn't really make any excuses for it. And he, to the chagrin of other left-wing groups, he was involved with the student movement in Vietnam, and he publicly denounced Ho Chi Minh for murdering, and I'm probably going to butcher the name, Tha Thu Thao, who was a Vietnamese Trotskyist and more active in the revolution against colonialism, I believe, with a group called Viet Minh. Basically, Ho Chi Minh came up, assassinated him, and sort of assumed the role of revolutionary. And when he wasn't doing journalism, he continued his career in economics and politics by becoming a philosopher, an actual writer on policy for the SWP, or the Socialist Workers' Party. And I believe what would happen is that they would have quarterly magazines as opposed to regular periodicals, and he would put forward these actual socialist theories rather than just regurgitating Marxism and the news. And he continued in this role, being a radical for the Socialist Workers' Party and a theorist until 2004, when he was getting older. And shortly after lecturing students at Cairo University in 2009, he became ill and had a heart attack and passed away, after which he was buried at Highgate Cemetery in the revolutionary section, right off the path from Karl Marx. And if you're noticing a trend here, there probably is one. I'll give you another one. Denzel Pierre was a journalist working in Ceylon, or colonial Sri Lanka, and was a sort of radical in the field of economics. Specifically, the paper that he worked with was called the Ceylon Observer. But by the 1970s, he was respected enough as a journalist and commentator to be hired out by the Hong Kong-based paper on East Asian politics called The Asian. He found himself in London in 1979 when he got a job working for the paper South, which was based in the city, and it covered aspects of Southeast Asian politics. Well, he was getting older, and he died in 1985 in London, after which half of his ashes were buried next to Karl Marx and the other half in his home country of Sri Lanka. Buried across the pathway from Hekmat is a man named Dr. Mansour Sabatian, and Sabatian was an Iranian revolutionary and surgeon who was active in freeing a certain number of student campaigners and political activists from Iranian prisons. He was a well-known democratic activist, and he was buried probably next to, I believe, Hekmat, because Hekmat represents a true idealism, an idealism that places ideology above Islam. And that was a major problem facing a lot of these Far Eastern, Middle Eastern political groups, because they would place more emphasis on cultural aspects than they would on political ones. And after his death, he had a death mask made of his face, so it was looking, essentially, at Hekmat across the way, and it was made on a large plinth of granite brought in from Iran, weighing 1.5 tons. In another corner of the cemetery was this grave belonging to Coke Martinez with the Spanish Republican flag on it, implying that he had some revolutionary role to play against Francisco Franco and fascists that were active in Spain up until the late Cold War. The couple, Jack and Marie Shapiro, were buried together across from the grave of Karl Marx, and these were longtime activists for communist groups inside of the United Kingdom. More specifically, as opposed to the dozen or so other communist parties inside of the UK, these two were members of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninists. This party prints a periodical called Lokar, and in November of 2010, this issue started discussing what had happened to them after they died. And there was an official statement. It said, "Representatives of CPGB-ML gathered here on 17 October, the day that Marie and Jack regularly celebrated the glorious October Revolution, to give a red salute to two longtime fighters for communism." This couple demonstrates the factionalism present in left-wing politics almost anywhere in the world. The Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninists, actually emerged from a 2004 split from another left-wing group called the Socialist Labour Party. This split occurred over minor differences in ideological outlook, and now they publish a magazine bi-monthly called The Proletariat, as well as Lokar. Now, well, the original grave I'd intended to see while I was in Highgate, apart from Karl Marx, was that of Mansour Hekmat. He demonstrates the sort of factionalism that you see inside of these left-wing movements. Really, again, anywhere in the world. This took place in Iran. Mansour himself was born in Iran and cycled through some of the universities and had a good head on his shoulders. He was an ideologue and a thinker, and he was one of the many communist groups that was backing the ousting of the Shah of Iran in 1978. But the problem was a lot of these other left-wing groups tended to cede power to the Islamists. And I believe, again, this is just my own personal opinion, but in a lot of these cases, these cultural revolutions tend to become more cultural, more nationalistic. That being said, once the Ayatollah had assumed power, a lot of these communist groups just stepped down. Now, Iran technically still has a lot of support from these communist groups, but they really just let the Islamists do what they want. Hekmat, on the other hand, had to flee in true Trotskyist fashion with a lot of his guys to Iraqi Kurdistan, I believe in 1991. And in 1991, they formed a group of revolutionary Iranian Kurdish people in this region of Iraq where communism and left-wing thought is actually still popular. You can see it today with the YPG and Rojava. And he formed Kamala, which was essentially, it's hard to find information on it, but they is implied wage a guerrilla war from across the border with Iran. And you can imagine this whole time, Hekmat and his Kurdish activists and his Iranian activists, as they move, they're splitting, they're forming different parties. Hekmat himself formed the Communist Party of Iran. And then when he went over to Iraq, he had to form a split branch, the Communist Party of Iraq, and these were all what you might call Hekmatists, or a true to the original Marxism. And Kamala itself practices a form of Maoism, but because Hekmat was such an educated man, he was looking at Chairman Mao and Joseph Stalin and saying that the Soviet Union and Red China were both states which had abandoned the original socialist thought, and that they wanted to strive to create something purely scientific in terms of political structure and true to the original Marxist-Leninist teachings. As obscure history as it is, it's fascinating to think that this is an Iran that could have been a secular Iran, that maybe, I mean, it's a huge country. It's 5 times larger than Iraq. Imagine what it would be like if it was like what Rojava is now in Syria. Fighting radical Islamists rather than giving them weapons and sending them abroad. Some interesting facts about Mansour Hekmat was that he was a subset of vegetarian called fruitarian, meaning he would eat no meat, but he would also eat no vegetables. Apart from this, ideologically, he was guided by what he saw as compassion, and he critiqued the feminist movement, saying that their stance on abortion was all wrong because it didn't have any element of compassion in it, which he felt was needed. You can naturally see the rift forming between him and other more mainstream left-wing groups like the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, or the communist parties in Iran that were opposed to the secularism that he was advocating, or even Saddam Hussein, who later opposed him because he was helping the Kurdish people. I don't believe it's a coincidence that right across from Hekmat is buried an Iraqi communist, Sadi Ali, who was a member of the Communist Party of Iraq. That is to say, he was a member of the Iraqi Communist Party, the oldest political party in the country, starting in the 1930s and developing really up until the 1970s, but which is still active today. The reason why the lag happened in the 1970s was that Saddam Hussein took over, and Baathism, or a sort of pan-Arabism or pan-Arab communism, took over the Middle East. Moving on to Yusuf Dadoo, he was an anti-apartheid Indian South African activist buried in London in 1983. Dadoo was declared a traitor because of his role in the South African Communist Party, in the South African Indian Congress, as well as various other left-wing organizations in South Africa. An early formative experience in his life was when his mother beat him for climbing a tree, and when he asked why, his mother said that the tree was reserved for whites only. He immediately began taking on this left-wing thought and developing his young mind into these progressive movements. Now, the reason why he allied, pretty unusually, India and South Africa, and met, I believe, at one point with Gandhi, was because in Marxist thought, colonialism is the logical extreme of imperialism and capitalism, because colonies are unsustainable and they rely on force and coercion to make an entire race or class of people subservient and a provider class. Once the revolution spreads in the colonies, this will put a strain on the colonizers and bring the revolution home. Therefore, by allying with groups that were against colonialism in India and by allying with Gandhi, they believed that they were, and they in fact were, bringing an end to the British Empire. And in this capacity, he was a proponent of the South African Communist Party in talking with the African National Congress, or the ANC, a party which is still very active in South African politics. The ANC itself is not as extreme as the SACP, but it's still a fairly extreme left-wing group. And he was sort of on the ground in advocating that these groups, all of these various factional communist parties and socialist parties, come together over shared similarities rather than minor differences in ideology. Now, because of his revolutionary activities, he was cycled through various underground cells of the South African Communist Party until eventually the Sharpsburg Massacre of 1960 precipitated. Essentially, this was over something called the Pass Law, And it's kind of amazing that I hadn't read about this before I read about Yusuf Dadoo, but the pass law was a separate system of passports made specifically for blacks in apartheid South Africa that would be needed for them to travel within their own country. Now, around this time, 7,000 people had descended on the police station, and police opened fire with live bullets, killing scores of them. 69 protesters died in this action, and over 180 were injured. Now, immediately, the South African government was looking for someone to blame, and they blamed all left-wing groups in South Africa, particularly ones like the South African Communist Party and the ANC, which they quickly made illegal, arresting most prominent leaders. Yusuf Dadoo himself went underground and was declared a traitor of the country and essentially criminal. And he took shelter by fleeing to London. Now, this was not initially his choice, but the South African Communist Party unanimously voted to send him to London as a representative in exile of the group. This was against his will because he actually wanted to stay on the ground and continue the fight in person, but they figured that he was such a great orator that sending him to London would be better. On his deathbed, he asked several of his friends in the SACP if they couldn't try to smuggle his body into South Africa to be buried on his home soil. Nothing ever really came of it, so he was buried in the next best place, next to Karl Marx. Unfortunately, he was given a Muslim burial against his best wishes, and his last words were, "You must never give up, always keep fighting." And finally, you have the grave of Claudia Vera Jones, who was born in Trinidad and Tobago, which was at the time a British colony, and later, as a journalist, immigrated to the USA. She was active as a black feminist and later started taking up roles in the Communist Party USA, or CPUSA, which at the time had a lot more extreme power, being financed by the Soviet Union with basically a network of spies. Of course, this made her very unpopular in America because this was all very well known. She didn't make any effort to really hide her associations, and they threatened to deport her back to Tobago. However, the colonial governor of Tobago essentially said, no, we refuse to have her because she'll just cause an insurrection over here. And so London basically took her on humanitarian grounds. And while she was in London, she actually was the one who pioneered the start of the Carnival Festival in London, which is now incredibly popular and a display of Caribbean culture every year. People forget her associations with it, and I believe the blue plaque honoring her only mentions the carnival and not her left-wing ideas or associations at all. I hope you learned a little bit about the history of these insurrectionary people and revolutionaries buried in London today. And I hope to shine a little bit of light on them because people only tend to take a look at the big guy himself and not the people buried around him.